Oh my, as a poetry and history nerd, putting this podcast together for you has been an absolute pleasure. If you remember last time, I outlined the development of waka prior to the late 1800s and gave you some idea as to why it was becoming a bit of a disappointing art. I left you with a promise that this time you were going to hear what happened to waka during the initial Tanka reforms and thereafter. So that's what I have for you today. Tanka reforms. Sounds a bit dull, but oh my, it was very interesting. The initial ideas and the concepts and movements that flowed from them. However, before I head off and tell you all about what I've been working on for you this week, I have a few reminders. Don't forget to put your poems in the comments on YouTube for the video prompt this month. You can put as many as you like. Linda reads them all. It's actually one of my favourite animals being featured this time. I've always wanted one as a pet, but I'm getting too old now. As I publish this, you have 5 days, yes, just 5 days left to send in your submissions for Madku. Bona M. Santos gave us a lovely presentation on what we're expecting. There's a link in the show notes in case you need it. The journal 424 is out and available via Buy Me a Coffee. Follow the link. And while you're there, maybe you'll buy me a coffee. The research I do for these podcasts takes a lot of time and a fair amount of cash to buy the books or access to articles. Anyway, enough bleating on. I'm glad you're with me. Shall we dive straight in and hear what one extremely unhappy bunny had to say about waka in 1894? Some people have been fighting to have licensed prostitution abolished. Others are campaigning to outlaw the sale of liquor. How is it, then, that no one has tried to start a movement to ban the waka of our time? Strong as my words may sound, I'm not overstating the case. Indulgence in drinking or in carnal pleasure harms the body in a way obvious to all. Indulgence in a certain type of poetry corrupts the spirit so unobtrusively that it goes unnoticed. Whereas the former kind of indulgence may lead to the loss of one's life, the latter kind may bring the entire nation to the brink of collapse. Ooh, that was Usano Tekan. I think it's safe to say he was more than a little disappointed, don't you? But why did he feel so strongly? The suggestion that waka could be responsible for the collapse of a nation does seem a little extreme. But then put yourself in his shoes in the time he's writing. This article appeared in the paper in May 1894. The First Sino-Japanese War started in July that year. He's a staff writer for the newspaper, and I don't know what the political flavour of that newspaper was, or whether the government put pressure on for journalists to write with nationalistic opinions, but nationalist fervour might have been something of the reason behind his passion. Either way, Yosano Tekan was one of the poets at the forefront of the Tanka reforms, along with a poet who I have a lot of time for, Shiki. Albeit they had different approaches. And of course, there were more poets involved. But let's recap a few of the issues. Lack of originality. Waka's still referencing past work, and Yosano Tekan felt that using this methodology often created stale, uninteresting pieces. Furthermore, he thought it was quite possible that the work they were emulating wasn't that good in the first place. Rude. Western literature was introduced to Japan around this time, and what the Japanese were seeing was that this literature had a greater emotional freedom of expression and that it had a freedom of form that waka did not officially have. So if you think of the Western poets influencing the Japanese poets of that time, we're looking at the likes of Robert Frost, W.B. Yeats, Rudyard Kipling, Byron, Shelley, etc. So there are many ideas about the direction of waka kicking about. Much disagreement between the poets and their groups, But there was one thing they did come to an agreement about. They coalesced around the name of the new form, Tanka. And the general public took that name to heart. So by 1910, Tanka was established in its own right. So let's have a look at some of the ideas and the poetry that went with them. Yosano Tekan's group advocated the writing of poetry of the self. The originality that they saw as sadly lacking in poetry of the day would come from the poet's individuality. You could maybe describe this as the poetry of romance, the Romantics. Their inspiration came as it did from the likes of Wordsworth, Shelley and Byron, who they felt wrote with a strong assertion of the ego, a passionate pursuit of the ideal, and defiant attitude towards existing moral and social conventions. These ideas were bolstered from what was called shintazishi, with apologies for my pronunciation. It was a style of poetry that had been arrived at by the translation of Western poetry into Japanese. In developing Tanka in this way, poets rejected restrictions of the previous waka, but followed in the traditional pattern of the poetry. So you have the lines going, well, as far as we're concerned in the West, short, long, long. Let's have the opening stanza from Byron's She Walks in Beauty to get a feel for what was inspiring these poets. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. And one of Yosano Tekan's poems. I'll forget I saw you standing with a stupefied look, hands holding your breasts, when an earthquake shook this morning. So bring me a drink, my dear. I'll forget I saw you standing with a stupefied look, hands holding your breasts, when an earthquake shook this morning. So bring me a drink, my dear. Masao Koshiki also had a hand in the reformation of waka, as I said. If you remember, he also had some thoughts about the reformation of haiku because he felt that haiku in the form it was being written in the late 1800s would become extinct. Well, he came to feel the same way about waka. His answer was not to follow the path of the Romantics. No. As he had for haiku, he advocated for the notion of the sketch from life, sashai. His argument for not going down the romantic route was that poems that express the poet's self might be quite dull, flat, and lifeless, unless, of course, that poet was highly individualized. But if a poet wrote about what they were seeing in life, then because people see things in different ways, the chances were that the poetry would be fresh and unique. He wrote an essay, a letter to Tanka poets, in which he gave poets a bit of advice for their observational poetry. And this instance, it's translated by Brouwer. When I say to treat new and unusual materials in your poems, some people will bring forth such machinery of civilization as trains and railroads. But such actions are very mistaken. The machinery of civilization consists for the most part of inelegant, unpoetic things, which are difficult to put into poems. However, if one wishes to make the attempt, there is nothing for it but to arrange and harmonize these things with other materials that are tasteful. To treat them without such harmonizing material, to say, for example, the wind blows along the railroad tracks, this is utterly flat and tasteless. It will give at least a somewhat better appearance if one combines these things with other materials. Saying, for example, that violets are blooming beside the railroad tracks, or that poppies scatter, or the pampas grass waves in the wake of the passing train, and the like. Another good way of treating such unpoetic materials is from a distant point of view. One means of effacing their prosaic, tasteless quality is to say, for example, that the train can be seen across a field of rape flowers, or that the train is passing in the distance beyond the broad fields of summer grass. That's probably good advice whether you're writing haiku or tanka, actually. And he wrote somewhere in the region of 2,500 tanka in his lifetime. None were published. Happily, we do have some examples. Shall we hear one? Beyond the glass door, the bright rays of the moon illuminating above the grove of trees a long trail of white cloud. Beyond the glass door, the bright rays of the moon illuminating above the grove of trees a long trail of white cloud. There you have it. He's put distance into practice. Now, as we know, Shiki died as a relatively young man in 1902. In his lifetime, his movement didn't make much of an impression on the Japanese world of poetry, but his disciples carried on his work. They created various magazines to promote their thinking, one of which, Arariji, the yew tree, founded in 1908, gained some momentum, apparently becoming the most prominent, successful tanka magazine in the country. It did have periods when it was, as we would say these days, offline or unpublished, but it had various revivals. Shall we hear some poetry from Shiki's disciples and successors? From the evening darkness of the low sky, unreached by the lamplight, a moth came flying in. From the evening darkness of the low sky, unreached by the lamplight, a moth came flying in. Saito Mokichi. The train speeds on, clear in the darkness of the night, the glimmering frost. In this cold, no human life will expire. The train speeds on, clear in the darkness of the night, the glimmering frost. In this cold, no human life will expire. Shaku Choku. A later development of Shiki's principle was to see life not as the poet's subjective self, but rather as descriptions of society. These ideas were supported by the naturalist literary theories of Europe, when combined with the social situation in Japan, which was beginning to exhibit the pitfalls of modern industrial society. One of the most notable poets for writing with this principle in mind was Ishikawa Takuboku, whose main fame came after his premature death. His thoughts of the writing of Tanka were that it should be like a diary, an honest diary. Here's one of my favourites. My wife came with our daughter on her back. I caught sight of her eyebrows through a blanket of snow. My wife came with our daughter on her back. I caught sight of her eyebrows through a blanket of snow. This I found in a translation by Roger Pulver. And if you want to hear more, there's a little piece on YouTube where he read some of Ishikawa Takuboku's poetry. And incidentally, if you want to know who translated all the poetry that I'm reading today, it will be in the essay that I'm writing to accompany these podcasts. Okuma Nobayuki. a poet and critical thinker on the subject of Tanka, thought Takaboku was a preeminent Tanka poet whose greatness as a Tanka poet is not only that he expressed his modern life consciousness through Tanka, but also in the fact that he was able to express this at a higher level in Tanka than he could in any of the other literary forms of his time, and thereby gave a new value to the Tanka form itself. Praise indeed. In the 20s, in what I can't help but feel is history repeating itself, poets wanted to adopt contemporary language and the rhythm of contemporary speech. They wanted what they termed modernity. Yet there was no consensus on the direction that this modernity could take. Mirroring the rise of nihilism and social disquiet within society, two distinct but polarized viewpoints emerged: a left-wing movement and a modernist approach. In 1925, the League of Proletarian Writers was founded, but our Tanka poets were a little bit late to the party. Only in 1928 did they form a League of Rising Tanka Poets, which in turn became the League of Proletarian Tanka Poets. As you would expect, they felt the existing Tanka were bourgeois, and that Tanka should be reflecting the plight of labourers and the need for social change. The language of their poetry was, of course, vernacular, and their choice of style primarily free verse Tanka. Ueda proposes that these committed poets, so enthused with their passion and determined that their poetry should articulate their ideology, generally wrote poems lacking in poetic skill and relatable emotion. He also feels that they failed to explain why their poems were in fact Tanka and not free verse. That poems from this school, which had any merit, were written by poets on the margins of this movement. And he cites Okuma Nobayuki as just such a poet. Calmly, the citizens watched the Labor Day demonstrations, several hundreds of them in the green shade. Calmly, the citizens watched the Labor Day demonstrations, several hundred of them in the green shade. Okuma Nobayuki published many articles on Tanka. He saw them as having only a marginal position in literature in this period, but he felt they had the potential to express modern consciousness. He was one of the poets instrumental in setting up the League of Rising Tanka Poets. He was not an ideologue, preferring a more humanistic approach. He moved away from his League colleagues when they criticised him for not being political enough. Probably would have got booted out. But anyway, he remained in the left-wing camp. Ultimately, having problems with the poetry of this group himself, saying it was overly prosaic and lacking in rhythmic sensitivity. And then, of course, at the other end of the spectrum were the modernists, poets writing pure poetry without any political or social content. Poets interested in using imagery, often surrealist, and symbolism. Their aim was to engage in a quest for transcendental truth and to articulate the results through images and symbols that went beyond the logic of ordinary thinking. These modernists formed their official movement a little later than the left-wing poets. In 1930, the Art School Tanka Club was formed, and Mikawa Samio, one of the foremost members of the group, said of Tanka that it is never to be found in struggles with muddy reality. Not sure I agree with him, but everyone has their viewpoint. He felt that it lay in abstracted emotion with no visible form or shape. And the next bit of his quotation is really very poetic. It makes the kind of soughing sound that an angel's wing would make in the wind. The spring mist thickens still more right on noon, nothing is visible. This, believe this above all, is Yamato. The spring mists thicken still more. Right on noon, nothing is visible. This, believe this above all, is Yamato. And that was a poem by Mikawa Samio. In an analysis of this poem, Leith Morton, who translated the version I read for you, tells us that its central conceit turns upon the paradox, a quintessentially modernist paradox, that by not being able to see Yamato, then a fully imagined Yamato of legend, the Yamato that is the historic heartland of Japan, that Yamato is completely visible, fully realized in the narrator and the reader's imagination. There's also a suggestion that the mist blanketing Yamato symbolizes the dark times that society is facing in the 1930s, that times are bleak, that beauty is enveloped, yet the paradox is that you know of its existence, don't you? After the Second World War, Japan, as many other countries did, faced more societal change. And if there's one thing we've learned so far about Tanka, if there's a societal change, there's another group of potential Tanka poets waiting to create their own group and potentially a journal or magazine to go with it. So it will come as no surprise to you to discover that alongside the existing groups, the left wing, the modernists, the romantics, there are new groups. A couple of societies emerged. The Society of New Tanka Poets marks a sea change. Although they wanted, surprise, surprise, to write Tanka reflecting the society emerging after the war, the poets were not of one mind how to do it. They were, rather than one school of thought, a group of like-minded poets who aspired to comprehend and describe the tragic fate of their generation within the framework of the classical genre. One of these poets was Kondo Yoshimi. He'd been a follower of Shiki, but believed in combining the ideals of Sashai with the desire for social change. He believed change could be achieved through political power, and thus a poet should be aware of the political in his or her poetry. This is one of his poems, written while in military service in China. Having grown up in the culture devoid of religion, inspired by what faith am I to fight this war? Having grown up in the culture devoid of religion, inspired by what faith am I to fight this war? It's a very interesting question, isn't it? A fellow poet of this group, writing around the same time and with similar experiences, Miya Shuji, wrote this. A short, quiet break in the frenzy of the battle, and in this silence a rooster cried, so terribly sadly. A short, quiet break in the frenzy of the battle, and in this silence a rooster cried, so terribly sadly. Maya Shuji was not of the mind that politics should be involved in poetry. Next we have Saito Fumi, a female poet who combined realism with imagery. I love the way she uses the inner voice of nature in this poem. Bugs are nibbling deep inside the age rings of the trees, the silence of the mountains in the withered grove. Bugs are nibbling deep inside the age rings of the trees, the silence of the mountains in the withered grove. Another group of poets could be described as avant-garde during this period. The poetry they wrote was thought to have much in common with those modernists of earlier, but they were writing less lyrical, more socially aware, and not surprisingly more intellectual poetry. Perhaps their ideals could be summed up by the poet Tsukamoto Kunio, when he said, "What mission could a short fixed verse form like Tanka have, except to promote visions?" And here I have a poet that perhaps shows the visions in his head, but also demonstrates the chaotic society that he sees around him. To me, it's a grotesque, maybe even surreal Tanka. Hands picking up a rose, hands holding a gun, hands caressing a lover, hands, like the hands of the clock that show 25 o'clock. Hands picking up a rose, hands holding a gun, hands caressing a lover, hands like the hands of the clock that show 25 o'clock. Now, whilst these last few poets and their colleagues continued writing into the 20th and 21st century, there's very little academic study of Japanese Tanka that I can find of poetry of this time. And I wondered why. Is it because of a trend in academic circles away from the values of studying literature? Is it an indication that in the West we devalue the learning of other languages? Is it that poets writing in English from whatever continent no longer value the history of Tanka, or haiku for that matter, that we worry less about the way we put our poems together and plunge ahead, writing our poetry without thinking about what we're doing? As to that last point, Alexander Dolin suggests a lack of interest, maybe even a lack of education in the tradition of classic forms in Japan, led to a drop in interest in Tanka and haiku. Don't get me wrong, they were being written in large numbers, but fewer numbers, if you get my drift. But then, in 1987, Tawara Machi wrote Salad Anniversary, a book of Tanka that sparked huge interest in the genre. Now, Dolin suggests that in this book she was reflecting the ideals of society, that things should be cute. He says of her work that it was precisely that. What she was doing was writing on a classic topic of Tanka, or the waka of the past, the topic of love. Perhaps it was that hit a nerve. Perhaps it was the cuteness, who knows? But Salad Anniversary was extremely popular. Folding towels, I wrap the smell of the sun. Perhaps one day I too shall be a mother. Folding towels, I wrap the smell of the sun. Perhaps one day I too shall be a mother. Tawara Machi from Salad Anniversary. And there'll be more Salad Anniversary in another podcast. And if I can get the follow-up book, Chocolate Revolution, a bit of that too. That book didn't go down quite so well. I'll tell you about that another time. So I hope you've enjoyed this week's run through Tanka School's post-reform. If you have info that you think would be valuable to think and talk about, let me know. The next couple of weeks, I'm returning to haiku and senryu. We have a visitor next week. I'll not spoil the surprise. Do come and join us. I really enjoyed the chat and hearing their poetry. I think you might too. Don't forget, submissions for Madku are open if you're listening to this before the 15th of September 2024. If you've missed it, go and check out on the submission pages what we're up to at the moment. There's a drop down you should consult too. And of course, there will always be a video prompt on YouTube to write for. And as I said before, you can contribute as many times as you would like. Thank you so much for joining me. If you'd like to read the essay that accompanies this series of Tanka podcasts, it'll be available on Buy Me a Coffee once the series is finished or part finished. But of course, if you were an ICE or a Busan member, it'll just plop into your mailbox when it's finished. Just one of the advantages of membership. Do have a read about these membership schemes on Buy Me a Coffee. There's a link in the show notes if you need it. So until next week, for some more haiku. Keep writing. Don't forget to check out some links in the show notes. Ciao!